You're not just tired. And if you're honest, you know that. This isn't the kind of tired that sleep fixes. It's not solved by a vacation. It's not burnout from working too hard. This exhaustion feels different. It feels internal, structural, existential. You wake up with energy, but no drive. You sit in conversations and feel absent. You look at your goals and feel strangely disconnected from them. You try to care about things that used to matter, and nothing moves. That's the unsettling part. It's not sadness. It's not stress. It's not even depression in the traditional sense. It's detachment. And detachment scares you because you can't explain it without sounding unstable. So, you downplay it. I'm just tired. I need a break. I've been working too much. But deep down, you feel it. Something is shutting down. Not externally, internally. There is a version of you that is losing power. And when identity loses power, energy goes with it. Because identity is fuel. It determines what excites you, what motivates you, what you tolerate, what you pursue, what you fear. When identity shifts, the old fuel stops burning. That's when exhaustion appears. Not because you did too much, but because you can't continue being who you've been. Here's what nobody explains. When your mind realizes you've outgrown your current structure, it doesn't announce it. It withdraws energy, quietly. You stop reacting the same way. You stop arguing. You stop explaining yourself. You stop chasing certain goals. You stop laughing at things that once entertained you. And this creates confusion, because on paper, your life might look fine. Nothing catastrophic happened, no dramatic ending. Just a slow fading of enthusiasm. But fading enthusiasm is not always decline. Sometimes it's refusal. Refusal to keep investing in something misaligned. Your nervous system is smarter than your ego. Your ego wants stability. Your ego wants to maintain identity. Your ego wants to preserve the image you've built. But your nervous system wants alignment. And when those two clash, exhaustion wins. Because exhaustion is the body's way of saying, I will not perform this version of you anymore. This is where most people misdiagnose themselves. They think, I'm lazy. I've lost discipline. I need more motivation. I'm falling behind. So they push harder. They double down. They force productivity. They overcommit socially. They try to recreate old ambition. But forcing life into a dying identity feels like dragging something heavy uphill. You can do it for a while, but the friction grows. You begin to resent your own efforts. You begin to feel irritated by things that once inspired you. And slowly, a thought forms. What if I don't want this anymore? That thought is terrifying, because if you don't want this anymore, then who are you? Most people never let that question breathe. They suppress it immediately. They go back to distraction, back to noise, back to routine. Because questioning identity feels like stepping into free fall. But here's the truth. This phase is not weakness. It's psychological molting. The snake doesn't burn out. It sheds. But shedding feels uncomfortable. It feels tight, constricting, irritating. And during that process, the snake moves less. It conserves energy, not because it's failing, because it's transforming. You are not exhausted because you are incapable. You are exhausted because your internal standards have moved, and your external life hasn't caught up. You see things differently now. You tolerate less. You crave depth where there is surface. You crave silence where there is noise. You crave purpose where there is repetition. And the more clearly you see, the harder it becomes to pretend. Pretending is expensive. Smiling when you don't mean it. Pursuing goals you've mentally outgrown. Maintaining dynamics that no longer reflect you. All of that drains energy. So your system begins to shut it down. You don't feel like socializing the same way. You don't feel like explaining yourself. You don't feel like performing enthusiasm. And you start worrying that something is wrong. But what if nothing is wrong? What if something is ending exactly when it needs to? Most identity deaths don't look dramatic. They look like emotional fatigue. They look like indifference. They look like a quiet, internal withdrawal. And here's the part that unsettles people the most. You don't miss the old drive. You miss the clarity, because the old identity, even if misaligned, gave you direction. Now you feel in between, not who you were, not yet who you're becoming. And that in-between space feels unstable. But instability is not collapse. It's reorganization. The mind dismantles before it rebuilds. It removes energy from outdated structures before it invests in new ones, and that removal feels like loss. But it may actually be preparation. The person you're exhausted from being might be the person you were never meant to remain. And once you see that possibility, you can't go back to interpreting this as simple burnout, because something deeper is happening, something quieter. And if you pay attention carefully, you'll notice the exhaustion didn't start randomly. It started after something shifted inside you, after you saw something differently, after you realized something you can't unknow. And that shift, that moment awareness expanded, is where everything truly began to change. When awareness expands, your old life starts to feel heavier, not because it objectively changed, but because you did. There is a moment, subtle and almost invisible, when you begin to see through your own patterns. You start recognizing the repetition in your routines, the predictability in conversations, the automatic responses you give without thinking, the roles you slip into without questioning. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's when the exhaustion quietly begins, because awareness increases friction. Before awareness, everything flows automatically. You laugh when expected. You pursue what you were told to pursue. You tolerate what everyone else tolerates. You chase the goals that once gave you validation. But after awareness, every action must pass through a filter, and filters consume energy. You begin catching yourself mid-sentence thinking, "Why am I saying this?" You start noticing how often you agree just to keep peace. You realize how many of your ambitions were fueled by proving something rather than building something. And that realization destabilizes your identity. Most people think identity is stable. It isn't. Identity is a collection of agreements you've made with yourself and with your environment. When those agreements no longer make sense, the structure weakens. This is why emotional exhaustion often follows clarity. Clarity exposes misalignment. You may notice that things that once excited you now feel hollow. Not because you're ungrateful, not because you're lazy, but because your internal compass recalibrated. And recalibration feels like loss before it feels like progress. You stop feeling energized by approval. You stop feeling driven by comparison. You stop caring about certain social dynamics that once felt important. And that scares you, because if you are no longer fueled by those things, What fuels you now? This is where most people misinterpret the situation. They assume they need to find motivation again. They search for inspiration. They consume more content. They try to recreate the emotional high that once propelled them forward. But the high doesn't return because the old fuel source has expired. Your nervous system refuses to run on validation, fear, and external pressure the way it once did. It has tasted awareness, and once awareness enters, performance becomes costly. Pretending requires energy, and when awareness rises, pretending feels heavy. This is why you feel drained around certain people. Not because they're bad, but because interacting requires you to temporarily operate from an outdated version of yourself. You feel the gap between who you are becoming and who you are expected to be. That gap is exhausting. You may also notice something else: irritation, not explosive anger, subtle irritation. You feel impatient with shallow conversations. You feel restless in familiar environments. You feel a quiet frustration when people repeat the same complaints without change. That irritation is not arrogance. It's misalignment becoming visible. When awareness grows, tolerance shrinks. You can no longer comfortably sit inside patterns that your mind has already outgrown. And yet, you don't fully know what replaces them. That's the uncomfortable space. You are aware enough to see the cracks, but not yet stable enough in your new identity to build something different. So you feel suspended, and suspension drains energy, because the mind wants resolution, it wants direction, it wants certainty. But transformation doesn't provide certainty. It provides dissolution first. Your old identity was built around certain assumptions: what success meant, what belonging required, what you needed to prove, what role you played in relationships. When awareness challenges those assumptions, the identity built around them weakens, and when identity weakens, your motivation becomes unstable. This is why emotional exhaustion often follows personal growth. Growth doesn't immediately give you strength. It removes illusions, and illusions are powerful sources of drive. Once you realize you were chasing approval more than purpose, the chase loses its energy. Once you see how much of your behavior was performance, the performance becomes draining. And this is where people become afraid. They think, if I'm not chasing like I used to, I'm falling behind. But what if the chase itself was misaligned? What if the exhaustion is not a signal of decline, but a signal of refinement? You are not losing your drive. You are losing your attachment to what once drove you. And those are not the same thing. There is a deeper motivation forming, but it doesn't scream. It doesn't create urgency. It doesn't panic you into movement. It waits. It waits for you to stop trying to resurrect the old self. Because as long as you keep trying to revive who you were, you delay who you are becoming. This is the hidden trigger of identity death: awareness. Once you become conscious of your own misalignment, you cannot fully return to unconscious living. And unconscious living is lighter. Conscious living requires responsibility. It requires you to admit that some of your exhaustion comes from tolerating what you no longer respect. It requires you to admit that some of your ambition was built on insecurity. It requires you to admit that some of your relationships were sustained by roles you don't want to play anymore. That admission is destabilizing, but it is also the beginning of real reconstruction. Because once awareness increases, you face a choice. You can shrink back into the old identity for comfort, or you can endure the temporary exhaustion that comes with dismantling it. And dismantling feels like emptiness before it feels like freedom. If you look closely, you'll see the pattern. The exhaustion began after you saw something differently, after a realization, after a moment of clarity, after you noticed that your environment no longer fits the person you're becoming. And that realization, once integrated, makes the old structure too tight to inhabit comfortably. The fatigue is not random. It's friction between awareness and outdated identity. And friction, if sustained long enough, forces change. The real question is not whether you're tired. The real question is whether you're willing to let the old structure collapse instead of exhausting yourself trying to hold it together. There is a point in this process where things start to feel unstable. Not dramatically unstable, but subtly disorienting. You may notice that you no longer know what you want with the same certainty. The goals that once felt solid now feel negotiable. The version of success you defended begins to feel incomplete. Even your reactions start to change in ways you didn't plan. This is where identity death becomes undeniable. Because identity is not just what you think about yourself. It is how you respond automatically to the world. It's your emotional reflexes, your ambitions, your social posture, your tolerance levels. When those reflexes begin to shift, you feel unfamiliar to yourself. And that unfamiliarity creates anxiety. You might think, why am I not reacting like I used to? Why don't I care the same way? Why does everything feel slightly distant? That distance is not numbness. It's detachment from an outdated framework. But detachment feels dangerous at first. Because if you detach from who you were, you temporarily exist without a clear structure. And the mind does not like structural ambiguity. The ego prefers a flawed identity over no identity at all. This is why so many people retreat at this stage. They start rebuilding the old personality out of fear. They reattach to the same goals. They re-engage in the same dynamics. They recreate the same urgency. And for a short time, it works. They feel normal again. But that normality costs them something. Because every time you override awareness to maintain comfort, you weaken your internal alignment. The body remembers, the nervous system remembers, and the exhaustion returns stronger. Here is what is actually happening beneath the surface. Your old identity was built to survive a certain level of consciousness. Now that your awareness has expanded, that identity cannot fully contain you anymore. So, it destabilizes. This destabilization feels like confusion. It feels like floating without direction. It feels like standing in a room you've lived in for years, and suddenly noticing the walls are cracked. You can't ignore the cracks anymore, but you also don't yet have a new house, and that in-between space is psychologically intense. You may experience waves of doubt, not just about your goals, but about your personality. You question your preferences, your habits, your emotional patterns. You start wondering who you are without the roles you've played, without being the responsible one, without being the ambitious one, without being the agreeable one, without being the one who always pushes through. When those roles weaken, you feel exposed, and exposure feels vulnerable. But this vulnerability is not regression. It's deconstruction, and deconstruction is necessary before reconstruction. Think about any structure being rebuilt. Before something stronger can be constructed, unstable components must be removed. From the outside, demolition looks chaotic. Dust rises, noise increases, the old shape disappears. But demolition is not destruction for the sake of loss. It is removal for the sake of redesign. What you are experiencing emotionally is psychological demolition. Old motivations are collapsing. Old insecurities are losing power. Old definitions of success are dissolving. But because the new structure isn't fully formed yet, your mind interprets this as emptiness. And emptiness is frightening. Because emptiness forces you to confront something most people avoid their entire lives. If I am not who I thought I was, then who am I? This question cannot be answered quickly, and that's where patience becomes critical. Most people try to answer too fast. They rush into new identities. They adopt new labels. They attach to new ideologies. They replace one rigid framework with another, just to escape the discomfort of uncertainty. But true identity reconstruction requires something rarer. It requires staying in the unknown long enough for something authentic to emerge. That means tolerating the temporary lack of clarity. It means accepting that you won't feel driven the same way. It means allowing silence where there used to be noise. And silence is uncomfortable, because in silence you cannot distract yourself from the fact that you are changing. You may also begin to notice that certain environments amplify the instability. Places where you once felt confident now feel foreign. Conversations that once felt effortless now feel draining. That's because environments reinforce identity. When your identity shifts, environments that supported the old version of you begin to feel misaligned. And this misalignment intensifies the sense of not belonging. But not belonging is not always rejection. Sometimes it is evidence of transition. You are not meant to permanently inhabit every phase of your life. Some phases are developmental. Some environments are preparatory. Some identities are temporary. And when you try to freeze them out of fear, you stagnate. The discomfort you feel now is a signal that stagnation is no longer acceptable to your psyche. Growth has been initiated, even if you didn't consciously choose it. The real challenge is this: can you tolerate the instability long enough for your new identity to take shape? Or will you retreat into the familiarity of who you used to be? Because returning is always easier in the short term, but long term, it fractures you. And something inside you already knows that returning is no longer an option. That's why the exhaustion won't let you settle. It keeps reminding you. It keeps pulling energy away from the old patterns. It keeps weakening what no longer aligns. And the more you resist it, the heavier it feels. But if you stop resisting, if you allow the dismantling, something shifts. The exhaustion stops feeling like collapse. It starts feeling like recalibration. And recalibration, though uncomfortable, is precise. It removes what is false. It preserves what is real. And it prepares you for a version of yourself that is not built on fear, approval, or unconscious repetition. But that version requires space, and space is created through loss. The question is whether you interpret that loss as failure, or as the necessary clearing before something stronger can stand. There is a moment in this transition where the exhaustion becomes unbearable, not because it increases, but because you begin to fight it. You start thinking, I need to fix this. And that's where most people interrupt their own evolution. They treat identity death like a problem to solve instead of a process to endure. They search for stimulation. They add new goals. They distract themselves with noise. They re-enter social environments that once gave them energy. They chase productivity just to feel movement again. But movement is not the same as alignment. You can move very fast in the wrong direction, and forcing clarity before it forms only creates artificial certainty. The ego hates uncertainty. It would rather choose the wrong identity than sit without one. So it whispers, just go back to who you were. Just pick something and commit. Just stop overthinking. But this isn't overthinking. It's internal restructuring, and restructuring requires a phase that feels like emptiness. The mistake most people make here is interpreting emptiness as failure. They assume that because they don't feel passionate, something is broken. Because they don't feel socially energized, they must be isolating incorrectly. Because they don't feel ambitious in the old way, they must be regressing. But ambition built on insecurity always burns hot and burns out. What you're experiencing now is not the loss of ambition. It's the loss of anxious ambition. There is a difference. Anxious ambition says, prove yourself. Aligned ambition says, build quietly. Anxious ambition is loud. Aligned ambition is steady. The problem is that you've been conditioned to recognize only the loud version, so when your motivation becomes quieter, slower, more deliberate, you panic. You think you've lost your edge, but what if you've lost your desperation? There is something powerful happening underneath the fatigue. Your system is recalibrating what is worth your energy. Before, you invested energy automatically. You responded instantly. You chased quickly. You agreed reflexively. You tolerated endlessly. Now there is hesitation. You pause before committing. You question before agreeing. You observe before reacting. And that pause feels like weakness because it disrupts your old rhythm. But the pause is intelligence. It is your mind refusing to pour energy into structures that are no longer stable. If you pay attention closely, you'll notice something subtle. The exhaustion is not constant. It intensifies in certain environments, around certain people, in specific conversations, when thinking about certain goals. That's not random. Your energy is withdrawing selectively. It is not collapsing entirely. It is refusing specific patterns. This is important because it means your system is not failing, it is filtering, and filtering requires awareness. The danger at this stage is emotional overcorrection. Some people become cynical. They detach too aggressively. They adopt a hardened persona and call it maturity. Others become overly spiritual. They float into abstract ideas and detach from reality completely. Both are avoidance. True reconstruction is quieter than both extremes. It doesn't need a dramatic personality shift. It doesn't need public declarations. It requires restraint. Restraint from rushing into a new label. Restraint from collapsing into isolation. Restraint from resurrecting your former identity out of comfort. You are in a recalibration phase, and recalibration feels slower than ambition. But slower does not mean weaker. It means deliberate. Think about what is actually being removed right now. You are losing the need to impress. You are losing the urgency to compete. You are losing tolerance for superficial validation. You are losing the reflex to say yes to everything. That loss can feel like emptiness, but it may be purification, because when the noise of validation fades, something else becomes audible. A quieter motive, a deeper standard, a more stable version of ambition that doesn't rely on adrenaline or approval. But that version requires patience, and patience feels unnatural in a culture addicted to speed. There will be moments where you want to quit the process, moments where you'll think it was easier when you were chasing constantly, moments where you'll envy people who seem certain. But certainty is often performance. Many people who appear driven are simply running from themselves. You are no longer running, you are dismantling, and dismantling is slower, but it is honest. The exhaustion is not asking you to collapse. It is asking you to stop pretending. Stop pretending you care about things you've outgrown. Stop pretending you want environments that shrink you. Stop pretending that your old ambitions still represent you. Once you stop pretending, energy begins to redistribute, not explosively, gradually. You may notice a new kind of focus emerging, not frantic, not desperate, just precise. A desire to build something that actually fits. A refusal to compromise your standards for convenience. A calm detachment from chaos. This is not the end of your drive. It is the end of unconscious drive, and unconscious drive is unstable. The exhaustion you feel is the cost of becoming conscious, and consciousness removes illusions before it grants power. The only real question now is whether you will trust the dismantling long enough to see what forms in its place. Because something is forming, even if you cannot name it yet. And once it stabilizes, you will not miss the version of yourself that required exhaustion to survive. Perfeito. Agora entramos na parte mais sensível do processo, o vazio prolongado. Aqui é onde muitos voltam atrás. Texto contínuo, mais profundo, mais cirúrgico. After the dismantling begins, there is a phase that almost nobody talks about. The quiet plateau. It's not dramatic. It's not chaotic. It's not even visibly destructive. It's just still. You're no longer fully invested in who you used to be, but you're not yet energized by who you're becoming. And that in-between space feels strangely flat. Not painful in an explosive way, not exciting either, just neutral. And neutrality can feel unsettling when you've lived your life through intensity. If your old identity was fueled by urgency, competition, validation, or proving yourself, this calmer internal state feels foreign. You may start wondering, why don't I feel as driven? Why don't I feel obsessed anymore? Have I lost my fire? But what if you haven't lost your fire? What if you've lost your anxiety? Many people mistake adrenaline for purpose. They confuse stress with meaning. They confuse urgency with importance. They confuse emotional highs with direction. When those highs disappear, they assume purpose disappeared with them, but purpose does not always arrive as intensity. Sometimes it arrives as clarity, and clarity is quiet. This phase is dangerous, not because it's destructive, but because it's subtle. Nothing feels urgent, and when nothing feels urgent, the ego panics. The ego needs stimulation to feel alive, so it tempts you. It tempts you to re-enter old dynamics, to create unnecessary drama, to provoke reactions, to overcommit, to chase something, anything, just to feel motion again, because motion feels safer than stillness. But stillness is where real reconstruction happens, When you are no longer reacting constantly, your system begins reorganizing in deeper layers. You start reevaluating what actually deserves your energy, not what impresses others, not what makes noise, what aligns. Alignment is different from excitement. Excitement is loud and fast. Alignment is steady and sustainable. The old you may have been impressive, driven, highly reactive, always available, always pushing. The emerging version of you is more selective, and selectivity feels slower. You answer less quickly. You commit less impulsively. You speak less unnecessarily. You tolerate less misalignment. And to someone addicted to speed, this feels like regression. But it's not regression, it's filtration. Your system is becoming more efficient. Instead of pouring energy everywhere, it is conserving and redirecting. That conservation can feel like emptiness if you're not used to it. But emptiness is often just space without distraction. And space is uncomfortable because it forces you to sit with yourself, without roles, without performance, without constant feedback. This is where the deeper fears surface. Who am I if I'm not constantly achieving? Who am I if I'm not constantly needed? Who am I if I'm not constantly chasing? Those questions don't have immediate answers, and that's the point. The answers are not meant to be forced. They are meant to emerge. But emergence requires patience. Most people never let this phase complete. They rush to fill the space. They adopt new identities too quickly. They reattach to new ambitions without integration. They start a new cycle before fully closing the old one. And so they repeat the same exhaustion under a different label. The real transformation happens when you resist that impulse, when you allow yourself to exist without immediate definition, when you tolerate the neutral zone long enough for something authentic to stabilize. Because underneath the stillness, something is adjusting. Your standards are recalibrating. Your boundaries are strengthening. Your motivations are reorganizing. You may not feel explosive passion, but you will notice something subtle. You no longer tolerate what drains you. You no longer chase approval instinctively. You no longer overextend yourself just to maintain connection. That is not weakness. That is refinement. Refinement is quiet. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need urgency. It builds depth, and depth takes time. The plateau is not a void. It is incubation. It may feel like you are doing nothing, but internally, you are restructuring. The old emotional triggers are losing influence. The old insecurities are losing authority. The old compulsions are weakening. This is not the loss of identity. It is the purification of identity. And purification always feels slower than expansion, but it is stronger. When this phase completes, your drive will return. Not chaotic, not desperate, not fueled by fear. It will return stable, directed, intentional. But it can only return if you do not interrupt the quiet phase with panic. The stillness you feel is not emptiness. It is preparation. And preparation does not shout. It waits. The question is whether you can wait with it, without trying to become someone again too quickly. At some point, something subtle begins to change, not dramatically, not loudly, but you start noticing that the exhaustion doesn't feel as heavy. It's still there, but it's different, less chaotic, more intentional. And that's when reconstruction quietly begins. You don't wake up one day with a brand new identity. You wake up one day and realize you no longer crave certain things. You no longer feel compelled to explain yourself. You no longer feel the need to respond immediately. You no longer feel pulled into conversations that drain you. There is a calm forming, not because everything is resolved, but because something inside you has accepted the dismantling. Acceptance is the turning point. The moment you stop trying to resurrect who you were, energy stops fighting you. It begins aligning. You start becoming more deliberate. You choose your words carefully. You choose your time carefully. You choose your energy carefully. And something interesting happens. Your life becomes quieter. Not empty, quieter. The noise reduces. The unnecessary urgency fades. The dramatic highs and lows lose their grip. And for the first time, you begin operating from stability instead of stimulation. This is where most people misunderstand strength. They think strength is intensity, but intensity is unstable. True strength is controlled energy, and controlled energy feels different from ambition driven by anxiety. It doesn't rush, it doesn't perform, it doesn't beg for recognition. It builds slowly. You may notice that your circle gets smaller, not because you cut people off aggressively, but because you stop overextending. You stop maintaining dynamics that require you to shrink. You stop engaging in conversations that feel performative. And when you stop feeding certain patterns, they dissolve on their own. This phase is quiet but powerful, because now you are no longer reacting from your old identity. You are responding from awareness. That difference changes everything. Before, your actions were often automatic. Now they are chosen. Before, you pursued goals out of fear of falling behind. Now you pursue goals that feel aligned, even if they take longer. Before, you tolerated misalignment to avoid discomfort. Now, you tolerate temporary discomfort to avoid misalignment. That shift marks the beginning of psychological maturity. But there is still one danger left: complacency. Once the chaos settles, you may feel tempted to stop here, to enjoy the calm, to remain detached, to avoid fully committing again. Because committing again feels risky. What if you rebuild incorrectly? What if you choose wrong? What if the exhaustion returns? But rebuilding is not about rushing into something new. It's about constructing consciously. The new identity does not need to be dramatic. It needs to be coherent. Coherence means your values, actions, and environment start aligning. It means your energy flows without friction. It means you are no longer trying to convince yourself to care. When alignment increases, energy increases naturally, not explosively, sustainably. You begin to feel small surges of clarity, ideas that feel clean, decisions that feel calm, boundaries that feel firm without aggression. You don't feel like proving anything anymore. And that absence of pressure is not laziness. It is internal security forming. Security is quieter than ambition, but it is stronger. The old identity needed validation to feel stable. The new identity needs integrity. Integrity is not flashy. It does not chase attention. It does not argue constantly. It does not react impulsively. It moves with intention. And once you taste that kind of internal stability, you understand something clearly. The exhaustion was not the enemy. It was the transition. Without it, you would have continued living on autopilot. Without it, you would have kept investing in structures that drained you. Without it, You would never have paused long enough to question your trajectory. The fatigue forced reflection. Reflection forced awareness. Awareness forced dismantling. And dismantling made space. Now, that space is being filled, not with noise, but with clarity. You may not feel invincible, you may not feel explosive drive, but you feel grounded, and grounded energy is far more powerful than frantic ambition. This is where the new version of you starts stabilizing, not the loud version, not the desperate version, the deliberate one. And deliberate people don't burn out the same way, because they don't run on fear. They build on alignment. What once exhausted you now simply doesn't interest you. What once controlled you now feels optional. And that is freedom, not dramatic freedom, but structural freedom, the kind that changes how you move through the world. The question is no longer, why am I so tired? It becomes, what deserves my energy now? And that question signals something important. You are no longer collapsing, you are choosing. And choosing from awareness is the beginning of real power. There comes a moment when you realize something undeniable. You're not trying to get your old energy back anymore. You're not chasing the previous version of yourself. You're not asking, how do I feel motivated like before? Because you understand now that version required exhaustion to survive. It needed urgency. It needed validation. It needed pressure. It needed constant stimulation. And you no longer do. The fatigue was never your weakness. It was the friction between who you were and who you were becoming. And friction always creates heat before it creates refinement. Now, something inside you is quieter, not empty, stable. You move differently. You don't rush to prove your intelligence. You don't rush to defend your position. You don't rush to maintain relationships that drain you. You don't rush into goals just to feel important. There is space between stimulus and response now. That space is power. And power doesn't feel dramatic. It feels controlled. You begin to notice that you don't need to explain your growth to anyone. You don't need to announce your transformation. You don't need to dramatize your detachment. You simply stop investing where there is no alignment, and you invest deeply where there is. This is where identity stabilizes, not through performance, not through intensity, through coherence. Your actions match your values, your boundaries match your standards, your energy matches your priorities, and once that coherence forms, something interesting happens. Your energy returns, but it doesn't come back as chaos. It returns as precision. You wake up with clarity instead of urgency. You build without broadcasting. You withdraw without resentment. You speak without over-explaining. You exist without needing constant affirmation. That is not burnout recovery. That is identity reconstruction completed. And here's what most people never realize. If you had never felt that emotional exhaustion, you would have never paused long enough to see your misalignment. If you had never felt that detachment, you would have continued performing indefinitely. If you had never questioned your own drive, you would have kept chasing goals that didn't belong to you. The exhaustion was a signal, not to quit life, but to quit unconscious living. And now you see the difference. There is a version of ambition that drains you, and a version that strengthens you. There is a version of connection that exhausts you, and a version that aligns with you. There is a version of identity built on fear, and a version built on awareness. You crossed that threshold, and once crossed, you cannot return to autopilot. That's the quiet transformation. You don't feel like a different person. You feel like a cleaner version of yourself, less reactive, less desperate, less distracted, more deliberate, more selective, more grounded. And grounded people don't burn out the same way because they no longer give energy to what contradicts them. If you recognize yourself in this, if you've been moving through this silent dismantling and rebuilding, understand something important. You are not behind. You are not collapsing. You are recalibrating. And recalibration is what separates impulsive growth from lasting strength. Most people avoid this phase. They numb it. They medicate it. They distract from it. Very few sit with it long enough to let it refine them. If you're still here, still listening, still thinking deeply about this process, that says something about you. It says you're not looking for motivation, you're looking for alignment, and alignment changes everything if this kind of clarity resonates with you. Not hype, not noise, not surface-level advice. Then stay connected here. This space is for people rebuilding quietly, people who are done chasing intensity and are ready to build stability. Because the next evolution isn't louder, it's sharper. And once you learn to recognize these internal shifts early, you stop wasting years fighting transitions that are trying to strengthen you. The exhaustion was not the end of you. It was the end of what no longer fit. And what you build from here won't require you to survive yourself. It will finally match you.